the entire panorama of her life obscure, but her name is forever familiar to our ear. No American child fails to recognize it. Her name and her image are inextricably associated with our national origins, her legend, a part of our Genesis myth, a moving symbol of our beginnings on this continent. The very bones of recorded history, the fragmentary biographical data have been irradiated by imagination and thus transmuted, have become tradition. And most people, when they think about Pocahontas today, think about the Disney movies, the 2 Disney movies in the image portrayed by Disney, which is very inaccurate. Now, why Pocahontas? And why did I choose to give this presentation? Well, when my daughter was in elementary school, I met the mother of one of her classmates whose last name was Bowling. Upon learning that I taught history at HCC, the mother told me very proudly that the family were descendants of Pocahontas. Now that was about close to 30 years ago, and you can imagine I was very skeptical. But when the library was chosen as one of the sites for the Smithsonian exhibit, I remembered the Bowlings. And I thought, all right, let me research this topic. So I offered to give this presentation. I want to make a few notes about sources. When I started my research, I quickly discovered that there are hundreds of sources about Pocahontas. Not exclusively always Pocahontas, but Jamestown, Pocahontas, and others. The earliest sources are accounts written by people like John Smith and other 17th century Jamestown era contemporaries. I've included the front page of John Smith's history, basically general history of Jamestown. And then interest in Pocahontas was in effect revived after the War of 1812, at the same time that Americans began to look for and put on pedestals George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and others. So it's interesting that after the War of 1812, really pretty much throughout the 19th century, lots of books, plays, poems, and paintings, most of which were very romanticized images of Pocahontas, were produced. In 1957, Jamestown celebrated the 350th anniversary of Jamestown's founding, and then just a few years ago, the 400th anniversary of Jamestown's founding. And for both of these events, scholars produced a wealth of new information, articles and books, offering more detailed and more diverse perspectives. In particular, for the 400th anniversary, you get a much richer source material. For example, Helen Roundtree wrote a book, Pocahontas, Powhatan, Opechancanough, 3 Indian Lives Changed by Jamestown. And in this book, she looks at Jamestown's history from the perspective of the Native Americans. Likewise, a very interesting book was published in 2007 by Dr. Linwood Little Bear Cutslow and Angela L. Silverstar Daniel. The title is The True Story of Pocahontas, The Other Side of History. This book recounts Pocahontas' life according to Mattapony oral history. So a history that's been passed down generation after generation. Taken together, these sources provide a fuller picture of the life and times in which Pocahontas lived and contributed to American history. Now, my intent today is to provide some context of the world in which Pocahontas lived, to describe the major events in her life to the extent that we know them, and to discuss Pocahontas' impact on her world and her legacy. So let's set the scene and look at Pocahontas' world. At the time of Pocahontas' birth in 1595, her father, and I'm just going to call him Powhatan because that was the name familiar to the English at the time. And one note about Indian Powhatan words, there's no common spelling. Powhatan was the paramount chief, or werewance, over 13,000 to 35,000 Algonquin-speaking people living in an area 1/5 the present-day size of Virginia. The Powhatan homeland covered the whole of the Chesapeake Bay and its 4 major tributary rivers: the Powhatan River, Pamunkey, Rappahannock, and Potawatomi. Powhatan, who actually came to power in the late 1560s, inherited leadership over 6 key tribes: the Mattaponi, Pamunkey, Appomattox, Arrowhead, Youngstown, and Powhatan. By 1600, we know that Powhatan was the paramount chief over 28 to 32 different tribes. So gradually, little by little, he had, either by war, outright conquest, or alliance, he brought these additional tribes into his homeland. The Powhatan people lived in small, self-sufficient agricultural villages, and they actually had wooden frame houses. They lived in wooden frame houses covered with bark. The women and the girls farmed and gathered wild foods and plants. The men and boys hunted and fished. They grew corn and vegetables and local tobacco. Now, as a rule, the people raised only enough food to feed their village and to pay tribute to their local chief, their werewance. And a werewance, the chief could be a woman or a man. Now, every few years when the soil was depleted, they just pack up. They'd abandon the old village and they'd move a few miles and set up a new one. In order to foster unity and allegiance to him, the paramount chief, Powhatan would marry women from different tribes. At one time, he may have had as many as 100 wives. Now, to set your mind at ease, very few of these wives or children actually lived with him at his capital. Once a child was born, the wife and child would usually return to the mother's village, and actually she was free then to remarry if she so chose. The children would be raised in the mother's village until they reached the age of maturity. And by that I mean usually about 13 or 14 years old. In 1607, at the time the English arrived in Jamestown, Powhatan was in his 60s. And he had as many as 20 living children. Now, that was curious to me because he'd had all these wives. But the average lifespan of most of these Indian people was between 30 and 40 years. So Powhatan outlived many of his children. He would, by the time he died, he was in his 80s, which is very unusual. Now, to govern this vast territory, Powhatan relied on the local village chiefs, the werewants, and it's interesting, many of these people, many of the local chiefs were actually related to Powhatan. Each tribe had also 1 or 2 or more priests, the Quacros, and the Quacros served as spiritual leaders, healers, and political advisors. The process of inheritance who would inherit the paramount chief's responsibilities was described as matrilineal. After a paramount chief died, in fact, the role passed to his brothers and then his sisters in turn. Then the role would pass to one of the sisters' children. After Powhatan died, it would pass to his brothers. The position would pass to his brothers. Now, what about Pocahontas? She was never going to inherit leadership. You know, she was believed to have been her father's favorite child, but favorite daughter, that is, but she was not in line to inherit leadership. So let's take a look at Pocahontas as a youth. According to Mattapony legend, Pocahontas was born in 1595 or 6. She was born to Powhatan and his first wife, who was also named Pocahontas. And according to the Mattapony, the mother died in childbirth. Pocahontas had several names. She was named Amonette or Matatoka, and raised by her older sister, Matachana, and her Mattapony aunts. So she grew up in the village of her mother, the Mattapony tribe. When she was about 10 years old, she went to live in her father's household. Now, she would just be another female along with whatever wives and children were living with Powhatan at that time. And as a young girl, she was expected to do all the chores and learn all the skills that an average adult Powhatan woman would know. So by the time she was 13, she was working right alongside the women in the village. Well, let's talk about Jamestown, because you can't have Pocahontas without the Jamestown element. David Price has written that before the English arrived in Powhatan's homeland, one of Powhatan's priests issued this prophecy: a nation would arise from the east and overcome Powhatan's empire. Well, Powhatan discounted the Europeans, mostly Spanish, as a threat, as they usually came in small numbers and didn't stay. Powhatan perceived the threat from the east as coming from the Chesapeake tribe situated to the east, and so he ordered the Chesapeake tribe to be extinguished. By the time Powhatan realized that the real threat came from much further away from England, it would be too late. Powhatan seriously underestimated the determination of the English to establish permanent residence in Powhatan's homeland. On April 26, 1607, 3 ships led by Captain Christopher Newport of the Virginia Company of London sailed into the Chesapeake Bay and up the Powhatan River. Now, after 2 weeks of exploring the riverbanks, Jamestown's leaders chose to settle on an unoccupied island in what they renamed the Powhatan River. They renamed the James River in honor of King James I. Now, the site was strategically located 60 miles upriver from the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, so that they could watch for any Spanish ships that might be in the area. The men spent time that first week clearing the land and building a fort. But an Indian attack within that very first week prompted the construction of a palisade fence around the fort. An Indian attack, by the time Captain Christopher Newport decided to return to England in June, what he left behind were 102 settlers and a completed fort, but nothing else. The Virginia Company instructed the settlers to seek mineral wealth, gold and silver, find an overland passage to the East Indies, locate the whereabouts of the lost colony survivors, and trade with the local Indians. Well, the men, because these first settlers were all men, they spent little energy on growing their own food. Instead, they relied on regular shipments of supplies from England and trade with the Indians. Not surprising, the food became scarce. Settlers soon suffered from malnutrition, starvation, and disease. This colony barely survived the very first few years. By May of 1610, only 60 out of some 500 settlers that had been brought to Jamestown survived. The survivors were ready to abandon the venture and return to England. As they were ready to leave, new ships arrived from England bringing more settlers and new supplies. So their departure was prevented. So from the start, this was decided before they'd even left England, there would be a governing council for the colony of 6 men, including Captain Newport, who was coming and going all the time. One of the 6 men was a 27-year-old English adventurer and soldier of fortune named John Smith. In fact, by the time Smith arrived, he was in hot water with the rest of the settlers. He was to be punished for mutiny on the ship. But fortunately for him, he was needed. Smith spent most of his time scouting the area and mapping the area. And when food became scarce, Smith would trade with the Indians for corn and other foodstuffs. Sometimes these exchanges were peaceful, other times they were not. Smith and his countrymen really didn't hesitate to brandish their weapons to get what they wanted from the Indians. In September 1608, Smith would be elected president of the council, and as president, he kept the colony alive by imposing strict discipline and requiring everyone to work. A little tangent here, the early settlers, most of whom were gentlemen or craftsmen, and they brought initially very few working men or farmers. And so it was important to get everyone to work to preserve this enterprise. Now, everybody has heard of the story that Pocahontas saved John Smith's life. Well, in his 1624 General History, the real title is The General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles, Smith recalls that Pocahontas saved his life not once, but twice. He first met Pocahontas in December of 1607 when he was on a scouting expedition and was taken captive by her uncle, Pocahontas. In the skirmish that preceded his capture, Smith killed one man, and his 2 English companions were killed by Pocahontas warriors. Pocahontas took Smith captive and then took him on a tour of the various Indian villages and finally delivered him to Powhatan. Smith expected to be executed, but instead was treated as an honored guest. One night, after a great feast, Smith recounts that he was physically thrown to the ground and his head held over a large stone. He expected the men clutching clubs to strike him to death. Instead, a young girl no older than 10 or 11, encircled his head with her arms and laid her own head on top of his, thus saving his life. Did this really happen? Modern scholars believe that Smith actually experienced a form of initiation rite, after which Powhatan referred to Smith as his adopted son. In fact, Powhatan offered Smith to be the werowance, the chief of a nearby village, to where he could move the Jamestown settlement because where they were located was very, very unhealthy. As I mentioned, it was an unoccupied island. Even the Indians didn't live there. Smith was leery and refused to take up this offer. In return for his generosity, Powhatan asked Smith to provide tribute in the form of metal or copper tools, a grindstone to grind corn, and 2 large guns. Well, Smith returned to Jamestown on January 1st, 1608, accompanied by Indian men carrying much-needed baskets of food. Smith, however, declined to turn over 2 of the settlement's cannons. In fact, he proved to them how difficult they were to use and also how heavy they were, especially for the Indian men to drag them through the forest. After this episode, Powhatan sent regular gifts of food to the fort, and Pocahontas, who usually accompanied the convoy to deliver messages to Smith and the others. It is said that one of the other residents in Jamestown said that she was a playful, joyful young child and that she would do cartwheels around the settlement with the young boys, the young English boys. But you have to appreciate her costume, which was nothing. So they were all kind of, perplexed by this small child who enjoyed coming to visit. And she became a sort of intermediary between the 2 groups. It really was not unusual for both English and Indian children, I mean young children, 10, 11, 12, to take up residence in each other's communities and to serve as interpreters and intermediaries. Pocahontas' visits to Jamestown led to some friendships with the English residents. John Smith recalls in his writings that she would sit with him and they would exchange words, so to try to teach each other their language. Smith recalled a second time when Pocahontas saved his life. Smith writes that in January 1609, Powhatan invited Smith to visit his capital and to bring men to build the great chief an English-style house. Once Smith was in Powhatan's presence, they talked, parlayed, and apparently these talks did not go well, rather poorly instead. One night, Pocahontas quietly warned Smith to take his men and to leave as her father was preparing to have them killed. Not surprising, relations between the Powhatans and the colonists became rather hostile. Powhatan, fearful of retaliation, actually moved his capital to another location. And he forbade Pocahontas from visiting Jamestown. In October 1609, Powhatan and Pocahontas received word that Smith had died, that he was on his way home to England and he had died. Pocahontas was We can't say she was bereft because we don't know, but I feel that she was upset because he had never said goodbye. With Smith gone, Powhatan ordered regular attacks on the Jamestown settlement. Well, what about Smith? He, in fact, had not died, but was seriously injured in a gunpowder accident. I think at some point, one of the sources said that it was not accidental, but a spark, somebody's spark from a flint caught a hold of the gunpowder that he was carrying, and it ignited, and he suffered really bad burns on his leg, so much so he had to be transported back to England. Not much is really known about Pocahontas' life between 1609 and 1613. She most likely marked the transition from girlhood into womanhood with the customary Powhatan Susquehanna ritual, after which she would have been eligible for courtship and marriage. During this ritual, according to the Mattapony, she actually took the name Pocahontas, meaning laughing and joyous one. This was allegedly the name of her mother, and it was the nickname given to her by her father. In 1610, after a period of courtship, Pocahontas married an Indian warrior, a Potawatomi warrior by the name of Pocum, and he was also the younger brother of the chief of the Potawatomi tribe. The chief's name was Japazah. Rumors began to circulate that there were threats to Pocahontas' life. So she moved from her father's capital to the village of the Potawatomis. And it was there that Pocahontas gave birth to a boy, to a son, they named Little Pocum. In 1613, longtime Jamestown resident, Captain Samuel Argyle, he learned that Pocahontas was living with the Potawatomis, and he planned to capture Pocahontas and use her as leverage in bargaining with Powhatan. Remember, hostilities between the two groups continued through this time. Argyle persuaded Chief Japazah to help him capture his sister-in-law. So Japazah and his wife tricked Pocahontas to go aboard Argyle's ship, whereupon she was taken captive. And you know what they got for their treachery? Can you guess? They were given a copper kettle pot. According to Mattapony legend, or oral history, Argyle at the same time had Pocum murdered, and fortunately little Pocum survived. He was not with his father at the time of the attack. Now, Jamestown's leaders, Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale, easy to confuse these two, Lieutenant Governor Sir Thomas Gates and Acting Governor Sir Thomas Dale, they sent word to Powhatan that Pocahontas was now their captive. She would be freed, provided Powhatan turned over 8 English prisoners, stolen tools and weapons, and a large quantity of corn. Well, 3 months went by with no word from Powhatan. Then finally, Powhatan delivered 7 prisoners, some weapons, and a shipment of corn. Pocahontas remained captive. Gates and Dale believed that Pocahontas was the key to restoring peace with the Indians, so they kept her. Powhatan offered once again to ransom his daughter, offering now broken weapons and tools, 500 bushels of corn, and his enduring friendship. Gates refused. talk about Pocahontas and her captivity. Apparently, what I've read is that she did not resist her captivity. It was not uncommon for people, even among Indian tribes, to be held for ransom. However, it was unusual to be held indefinitely and for a captive to be expected to adapt to a new culture and lifestyle. Pocahontas was used to bathing daily. That's all the rivers and streams the Indians bathed daily. She was used to doing women's work, to being useful. She was used to going about freely anywhere she wanted. Instead, she was confined. She was required to cover her body with English women's clothing, which consisted of corsets, long skirts, and multiple layers. She was expected not to wash frequently and to eat food that was foreign to her, but also at regimented times. It was interesting that the Powhatans ate when they were hungry, and they didn't usually, unless it was a big feast, they didn't stand on ceremony. They would sometimes just, eat what they had or eat at the time, even standing up. In addition, she was required to attend daily religious services. Her captors treated Pocahontas like a proper English lady, even having servants to meet her needs. After 3 months, Sir Thomas Dale, moved Pocahontas from Jamestown to Henrico, which is near present-day Richmond, and placed her into the care of Reverend Alexander Whitaker, a 27-year-old Cambridge-educated Protestant minister. His job was to instruct Pocahontas in the English language and the Christian religion. Whitaker did teach her to read and write English so she could study the newly published King James Version of the Bible. Now, a third man was brought in to help with the instruction. He was John Rolfe, a 28-year-old English widow. So, who was this guy, John Rolfe? Well, there is still question about where he was from. He was likely born in Norfolk, England, in 1585. In May of 1609, Rolfe and his pregnant wife were on the way to Jamestown when a hurricane wrecked their ship. It was one of a fleet of about 10 ships, wrecked their ship on the reefs right outside of Bermuda. They were in Bermuda for about 10 months, during which time Mrs. Rolfe gave birth to a daughter who died shortly thereafter. Finally, Rolfe and his wife arrived in Jamestown on May 24, 1610. Mrs. Rolfe, we're not really sure. She either died on the ship or she died shortly after arriving in Jamestown. Rolfe then focused his energy into growing tobacco. Now, the premier type of tobacco at this time was grown by the Spanish, and it was illegal for anyone but people associated with the Spanish colonies to have any Spanish tobacco seed. But somehow, Rolfe got a hold of some of these Spanish tobacco seeds. He brought them with him to Jamestown, planted them, and harvested his first crop in 1611. The following year, Rolfe exported to England the colony's first crop of cured tobacco. And it went over very well. It wasn't as good as Spanish tobacco, but it was very close. Growing tobacco brought Rolfe considerable income and status. Other colonists soon followed Rolfe's example, clearing as much land as they could on which to grow tobacco and become wealthy as well. As part of Pocahontas's education, Dale wanted her to, quote, mingle with the better sort of English men and women, to observe their manners and ways, close quote. In July 1613, Dale introduced her to John Rolfe, who was then actually Secretary of the Colony. He was an enterprising and up-and-coming planter, and according to Dale's estimation, he was a good Christian man. In early 1614, Rolfe claimed that he had fallen in love with Pocahontas and she with him. Rolfe formally requested permission to marry Pocahontas. Now, interestingly, in a last-ditch effort to secure the remainder of Pocahontas' ransom, Dale took Pocahontas and Rolfe and 150 armed men to Powhatan's capital. At that time, this is the time when Pocahontas said to her father that she would be marrying John Rolfe. Powhatan consented to the marriage, but he refused to attend the wedding. He was very, very paranoid, that he would be taken captive. Before the marriage, Pocahontas was baptized a Christian, and she took the name Rebecca, after the biblical bride who carried, quote, 2 nations in thy womb, close quote. On April 5th, 1614, in Henrico, Pocahontas married John Rolfe. Among the witnesses was her elderly Powhatan uncle and his 2 sons. Again, not her father. Then, on January 30th, 1615, 9 months and 25 days after their marriage, Pocahontas gave birth to a boy they named Thomas. Now, according to Mattapony oral history, Thomas was not Rolfe's son, but the product of a rape by either Gates or Dale. And Pocahontas was taken to Henrico from Jamestown to hide the fact that she was pregnant. The Mattapony claimed that Thomas was born earlier than the date recorded. So when you're looking for specific dates relating to this period in history, there is a lot of inconsistency. Regardless, the marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas ushered in a period of peace between the colony and the Powhatan Indians, which is known as the Peace of Pocahontas. And this was a peace that lasted until her death. In June of 1616, Sir Thomas Dale accompanied the Rolfe family and a dozen Powhatan men and women, including Pocahontas' sister Matachina and her priest husband. They went to England. The ship that carried them also carried a cargo full of tobacco. The Virginia Company used this trip to demonstrate to potential investors the company's success in civilizing the natives and having a viable cash crop. The company covered all expenses for Pocahontas and her entourage, putting her up in good establishments, dressing her in fine garments, and introducing her, that is Lady Rebecca, Indian Princess, to high-ranking members of English society, and even to the King and Queen of England. The company commissioned a Dutch artist by the name of Simon Vanderpas to make a portrait of Lady Rebecca. Vanderpas's engraving is the only likeness made of Pocahontas during her lifetime. The portrait on the side of the slide shows Pocahontas dressed as an English lady in an expensively embroidered dress with a large starched ruff collar framing her face. She wears a high hat with a feather and is holding a fan of 3 white feathers. Supposedly, the 3 feathers was the insignia of the Prince of Wales. Truly, Pocahontas was, quote, the sensation of the London social scene that year. Now, it's interesting if you read about this, the trip to England, it is the sources are very detailed about this trip. And it's very clear that Rolfe was kind of, on the sidelines, and she was the focal point of this trip. Also was her uncle, not her uncle, her brother-in-law, the Powhatan priest, who refused to dress in English clothing despite the weather, and was half naked, despite the weather, and he was introduced to quite a few religious leaders, and they through interpreters, discussed their different religious beliefs. So the 2 of them, Pocahontas and the priest, made a huge impression. When Pocahontas and several other Indians started showing signs of illness, the group was moved outside of London, which was a dirty, filthy city at that time. Very unhygienic, and the air was not good either. They were moved to Middlesex outside of London, and there they stayed in the home of Sir George Percy, which, by the way, was someone whom Pocahontas knew from the early days of Jamestown. During this time, during their departure from London, Rolfe actually took Pocahontas to visit his family home in Petcham outside of Norfolk. Sometime that winter, Pocahontas had a very interesting visit. John Smith called on Pocahontas one afternoon, and she was shocked to discover that Smith was alive. According to Oscar, one of my sources, Pocahontas didn't speak to him for several hours. And when she did, she expressed her outrage at having been deceived by him. Now, she was introduced to several other acquaintances or people who had heard about her, who had studied Jamestown, like Thomas Harriot. She met Sir Walter Raleigh, among others. In early 1617, Rolfe decided to take everyone home to Virginia. Not only was Pocahontas ill, but so was their son. Before the group left England, the Virginia Company voted to give the Rolfes a grant of money, about £100, which they expected the Rolfes to found a school specifically to Christianize the Powhatan children. The ship set sail in March of 1617, and by the time the ship reached Gravesend, which I think was the last stop before the ship left England altogether, Pocahontas was critically ill by the time they reached Gravesend. She was taken ashore, attended by a local physician who, physicians in those days, they bled people, among other things. And not surprising, she died. They buried her at St. George's Church in Gravesend on March 21st, 1617. Since his son Thomas was too ill to travel, Rolfe left his son in England in the care of his brother Henry. Now, once in Virginia, Rolfe resumed his role as secretary and general recorder of the colony. He later became a member of the governor's council, and in 1619 he was elected to Virginia's first General Assembly. This was the same year he married, for a third time, he married Jane Pierce, a daughter of an alum from Jamestown, Captain William Pierce. In 1620 or 21, the couple had a daughter they named Elizabeth, Very little is known about her. At one point, I saw a source say that she died maybe at 4 years old, but really the record of Elizabeth is gone. Rolfe himself died in March of 1622. His circumstances, of his death are unknown. In his will, though, Rolfe left all his land holdings to his son, Thomas. Now, his wife went on to remarry Captain Roger Smith, but she would not inherit, as women generally did not inherit at that time. Upon learning of Pocahontas' death, Powhatan was apparently, according to the sources, inconsolable. Powhatan's priests actually relieved him of his duties, and he died soon after in April 1618. Again, he was in his 80s. He was succeeded by his brothers, Opie-Ham, but apparently he was very weak and very ineffective. And instead, the younger brother, Opie-Chickanoff, who was the werowance of the Pamunkey tribe, but he was also very close to Powhatan as his war chief. Opie-Chickanoff really served as the paramount chief for the Powhatan people. Now, just jumping ahead just a little bit, continued pressure for Indian land by ever-growing numbers of English settlers finally prompted Opie-Chickanoff to lead a massive assault against Jamestown on March 20th, 1622. 1/3 of the settler population was killed in that single day. So over 300 people were killed. This attack then ignited an intermittent multi-year war between the Powhatan people and the English colonists, which only ended with Opie-Chickanoff's capture in 1646. He also died the same year. He was murdered while he was held captive in his cell. He was 90 or 91 years old. Well, what about Thomas Rolfe? Well, he was 20 years old when he returned to Virginia in 1635. From his father and his grandfather Powhatan, Thomas inherited thousands of acres of land along the James River, including Barnea, which was the plantation where he was born. Thomas then married an English colonist, Jane Poythress, and together they had one child, Jane Rolfe. In 1641, Thomas petitioned Virginia's royal governor for permission to meet his great uncle, Opie-Chickanoff, which was actually granted. But we don't know what the conversation was like, and no notes or record of the meeting was ever kept. In 1646, Thomas accepted a lieutenant's commission in the Virginia Colonial Militia. And for his service, I assume fighting Indians, the General Assembly granted Thomas the land known as Fort James, which I take to be the original settlement where Jamestown was originally founded. Now, despite his mother being Pocahontas and being half Powhatan, Thomas Rolfe, he was raised as an Englishman, and he really chose to live as an Englishman while in Virginia. So what about Pocahontas? What is her significance and legacy? Pocahontas was a very outgoing and cheerful young girl who displayed unusual courage to extend hospitality and friendship to strangers in her land. She actually saw it as her responsibility to provide support to Jamestown when it was most needed. The colony likely would not have survived without her intervention. After her capture and during her confinement, Pocahontas again displayed tremendous courage. She seems to have accepted her fate with grace and patience. Willingly or not, she adapted to a foreign culture, language, and religion. Some scholars have suggested that Pocahontas, like other similar captives, suffered from Stockholm Syndrome, developing psychological attachment or feeling for her captives. Even so, don't forget that her marriage to John Rolfe brought temporary peace to the two communities. By marrying John Rolfe, Pocahontas also contributed to the colony's ultimate success. She and other Indians shared their knowledge of tobacco cultivation. Tobacco became the colony's primary cash crop, ensuring the survival of England's first permanent colony in North America. Now, while I did not include it on my outline, I did want to say something about Chief Powhatan. I mean, Chief Powhatan, to his peril, seriously underestimated the threat the English represented to the future of his people. At the outset, he thought he could use the English. Now, Powhatan was, very wily, he was very intelligent, he's very well respected, so he thought, he could use the English against the Spanish and against the Powhatan's Indian enemies. But he seriously underestimated the number of people the Virginia Company could bring to Virginia. It is not until Pocahontas' brother-in-law returned from England in 1617 that Powhatan finally grasped the issue. Now, when he sent his brother-in-law, her brother-in-law to England, he was to count the number of people in England. And he had a stick by which he was to make a notch, counting the people. He realized that was impossible. And when he came back and reported to Powhatan, he said, this population is overwhelming. And Powhatan finally grasped that it was only a matter of time before his people would be overrun and the land would no longer be theirs. Pocahontas is considered today a universal heroine. What little is known about Pocahontas' life and her role in the founding of the Virginia colony has inspired a wealth of books, plays, poems, paintings, sculptures, documentaries, and film. Her life has captured the imagination of people of all ages and backgrounds, scholars and non-scholars alike. The one thing that can be stated with certainty is that her story has fascinated people for more than 4 centuries. And look at all you. You were interested enough to come here today. So we will undoubtedly still be interested in Pocahontas years from now. We can also see Pocahontas as kind of an American mother figure, kind of a national maternal figure. She lives on through her sons and their descendants. The Mattaponi claim that little Cocoon survived and that his descendants are numerous and include the singer-entertainer Wayne Newton and the Newton family. Most of Pocahontas' descendants, though, trace their lineage through Thomas Rolfe and his wife and his daughter Jane Rolfe. You can see that Jane Rolfe in 1675, Jane Rolfe married Colonel Robert Bowling, and they had one son, John Fairfax Bowling. John Fairfax Bowling and his wife Mary Kennan, though, instead of having one child, which had been the pattern for several generations, they had 6 children. Each of these children married, and had multiple children. And so this pattern continued for generations, resulting in thousands of Pocahontas descendants. The descendants of John Bowling and Mary Kennan are referred to as Red Bowlings. Now, Jane Roth died very early. She may have died in childbirth. So Robert Bowling married Anne Stith, who was quite younger than he was. She was only about 20 years old. And they then, very prolific man, they then had 7 children. And their children then had children, and so forth. And they are referred to as the White Bowlings. They are not actually descendants of Pocahontas. George H.W. Bush and his sons are actually descendants of the White Bowlings. Descendants of the Red Bowlings include, but are not limited to, Edith Bowling Wilson, Percival Lowell, who was a 19th century astronomer and mathematician for whom the Lowell Observatory is named, Nancy Reagan, Edward Norton. You have lots of people, including Martha Custis and maybe even Thomas Jefferson and many others. So, is it possible that you could be a descendant of Pocahontas? So this is a good time for some questions and answers because I've been talking to you for almost an hour. What questions do you have? I'll endeavor to answer them.
Did you conclude that the bowling that you met years ago when your daughter was young?
I suppose she was, because there are literally thousands of people who claim descent. Yes?
It's a trivial question, but in that portrait, that engraving, she's wearing that high hat.
Yes.
Was that an Indian style hat, or was that a
I think it was English style.
Okay.
And that feather was probably, intended to Indianize her.
Oh, okay.
I think I made up my own word.
You used Hatton, Paul Hatton and Poe Hatton.
Yes, the name,
The
his name was also the name referred to for the whole Indian Confederacy.
And so when we hear Manhattan and know that it was sold by the Indians for
The Lenape Indians.
So Hatton, I mean, did that just run all the way through all Indians?
I don't know. A lot of our, words come straight from Indian language. Any other questions? I wanted to tell you a couple of observations I made when I was researching. I taught history for eons, it felt like, or islands, whatever. So we always, went through Jamestown, and it never occurred to me until I started doing this research that the English were still looking for the lost colony, the people who had originally settled in Roanoke. And after, the English ships left them, they were not there any longer. And so the English still believed that some of these people were still alive. Because if you know where the location is, Roanoke's not that far from the Chesapeake Bay. And so there was thought that, perhaps some of the younger people were still alive. Anything's possible.
I've heard too that that particular group of people may have been taken into Indian tribes.
Yes, and there's spotty records of, oh, this Indian had blue eyes, or blonde hair, or Didn't have Indian features, yeah. And the Spanish, the Indians were very familiar with the Spanish because long before the English ever arrived there, the Spanish ships had come along the coast and would kidnap Indian people and take them to wherever. So the Spanish were very brutal. And when the English arrived, the Indian people were surprised that they were not as brutal and they didn't behave the same way. So that's why, even the English were leery of the Spanish putting their colony 60 miles upriver. But again, in the research, my favorite area is, her trip to England, because it stands to reason that would be richly detailed because, she was being reported on it all the time. Yes.
The display, the exhibit also talks about her as perhaps a traitor, more negative connotations than we've ever given Pocahontas, or that you gave in your presentation. If the people who are looking at her as perhaps a traitor to her people, or someone who's interested in personal gain, where is that coming from? Are those Native Americans who are looking at the destruction of the culture that was here when the Europeans came?
Well, I could see from the Indian point of view that, she didn't have to be hospitable to them. She didn't have to support them. The Mattaponi people, they're one of 2 tribes that still exist from that whole region. And they say that, it was part of their culture to be hospitable. But they really downplay her as somebody important. They talk about her as being very ordinary, not a heroine in any sense of the word. So I think for me the trouble was, where did she fit in? Because these earlier sources were, romanticizing her, and then the Indian sources, kind of downplaying her. So I could see how Indian people would think she betrayed them, but I don't think they could appreciate the situation she was in. She's not going to be released. When she was confined, she was, a captive. Chair.
I think the exhibit also makes the point that, or brings up the idea that Captain John Smith was not a reliable source, that he was a bit bombastic and liked to romanticize his own life.
Yes.
And so therefore the idea that she had saved him twice might be...
Yes. Well, that's why I said it came from him, this story. But, in talking about her, you have to bring that up because that's what everybody knows about. He was a rascal. He was an adventurer. His life before Jamestown was as a soldier of fortune, a mercenary. He fought with the Turks, or against the Turks. He fought with the Hungarians against the Turks, and he was captured himself and sold as a slave at one point, managed to escape. So he had a really adventurous life. And he wanted to go back to Jamestown after he was sidelined in England. He wanted to go back and proposed, taking a group of people to what we think of as New England. And basically the authorities said, no, thank you. You've served your time. But I agree, he was a rascal. Thank you all for coming today. I appreciate you coming to hear what I had to say about Pocahontas. What?
Yeah, I was going to, I guess a couple of quick questions.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
Did they know what she died on? What was it? I guess a disease of some sort?
It's been described differently. One disease that has been mentioned is tuberculosis. There are other possibilities, though. As I said, England was very dirty,
Yeah,
and the air was very unclean.
yeah.
And I'm not surprised that more of the Indians did die. And people in England truly did not bathe very often. And
And there were lots of diseases that they Indians had
overcrowding in
never been
London.
exposed to
Right.
that they could, catch.
Well, I was kind of surprised, actually, unlike what happened in Plymouth. These Powhatan Indians have been exposed to European diseases because of the Spanish raids.
I see, yeah,
So they were a little more immune.
yeah.
It's the English, when they arrived, they were not. They didn't have the immunities to that area, the Chesapeake Bay area.
Now, you said that island that they lived on was not healthy. Was it the climate there? Was it?
No, it was the fact that kind of stuck with this thing. Let me see if I can go back.
Uh,
Okay. So here's Jamestown, and what would happen is the water of the bay goes in and then goes out again. But the water would be polluted because the English knew no better, and they polluted their own water.
oh, yeah,
So they were drinking polluted water.
I see.
And the Indians knew that was a diseased place. They didn't even want to be there. And so that's why they offered another location for the settlement.
Yeah.
And I mentioned also that the first colonists, they didn't know how to farm.
Right,
You know, they didn't know how to keep their area clean.
right,
So they might dig their latrine trenches too close to the settlement.
yeah.
I mean, they just had no clue how to survive.
Were they like, you said they were craftsmen who were like, I guess carpenters and blacksmiths and...
You know, there are people who, they actually sent at some point they sent some fellows to experiment with growing silk. Another group came to try to produce grapes for wine.
I see.
Some German jewelers came. In fact, some of those Germans were taken in by Powhatan, and they realized it was much safer living there with Powhatan. But yeah, can you imagine taking all these people, and most of them are gentlemen with their valets?
I see.
Wasn't very well thought out.
I guess merchants are businessmen trying to start, a business over here.
Well, they were looking for riches, easy, quick wealth.
Yeah,
And they knew too that if they didn't come up with something, the company's investors would not continue to invest. Therefore, the supplies would cease.
I see.
So bringing Pocahontas to England, that was really a propaganda trip. The idea was, oh, you guys need to keep investing and invest more because, the colony is doing great. We're meeting this moral mission and the financial mission.
Right.
It's really for me, I think it's really an example of two cultures clashing. And the foreign culture really ends up taking over. By 1675, the Indians have been forced out almost to the mountains, and they are on reservations. I appreciate your question, so.
During this time period, I think the cannibalism incident occurred.
Yes. It happened in the winter of 1609, 1610, which historians refer to as the starving times. And food became so scarce, and the Indians basically stopped providing food. And they basically, closed ranks. Because one thing that the English kept demanding more and more and more, and they were, at 1607 was a period of drought, so they weren't growing as much corn. And so the stories are they, turned to eating their leather shoes. The colonists ate their leather shoes. One man allegedly did in his wife, or she died, and he tried every way to cook her flesh. Boiled it, broiled it, fried it, everything. When finally authority was, resumed, he was punished, but that was, by the spring of 1610. That's why I said only 60 out of 500 settlers that have been brought to Jamestown were alive.
Well, it's kind of funny because one of my ancestors had been in Bermuda or that area and then been shipwrecked and then ended up in Jamestown just about that time. And I've often wondered, he later went to the Plymouth colony.
Yeah.
But I've often wondered, did he have to participate? Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. It was rough. I mean, Karen Ordell Kupperman wrote, I read this article many years ago, and she said about the Jamestown colonists. The company was putting so much pressure on them to produce. And yet, the company did not appreciate the psychological impact that here these people were in a foreign land being forced to, produce something, and they were disconnected from home, and they were depressed. I mean, they were malnourished, and they were very depressed. So, to me, it's not surprising that people died in the numbers that they did. These have been very interesting questions. I will remain if you have further questions. I do appreciate you coming on
Thank
this
you.
winter day.
See you later.